When I left my private island for a year, I expected to return to silence, sand, and the same untouched paradise I owned. Instead, I found 50 luxury cabins, tourists everywhere, and an HOA claiming they ran the island now. They stole my land, or so they thought, because what happened next made every board member regret ever stepping foot here. The island had always been more than a piece of land to me. It was the last thing my grandfather left behind. A quiet stretch of dense forest surrounded by calm water. A place where storms rarely felt threatening and time seemed willing to slow down. For years I kept it untouched, visiting during summers, fishing off the rocky shore, walking the moss-covered trails my grandfather once carved with his own hands. The island was a memory preserved, a sanctuary kept separate from the noise of city life. When I left for a one-year research assignment overseas, I never imagined anything would change. The island wasn't accessible to the public. The deed was airtight, and no one had a legal right to step foot on it without my permission. I had locked everything up before leaving, the boats, the storage shed, the old cabin near the shoreline. My neighbors watched the waters. The Coast Guard patrolled the bay. Nothing could possibly disturb it. At least that's what I thought. But the moment my plane landed back home, I felt something was wrong. It wasn't a premonition, more like a strange tension in the air. A feeling that too much time had passed, and not enough attention had been paid to what I owned. Messages from locals had been vague. "You should check your island as soon as you return," one text had said. Another simply read, "Something big happened while you were gone." No explanations. No details. Just warnings. 2 days later, I chartered a boat and headed across the water. The moment the island came into view, my chest tightened. There was movement. Too much of it. Vehicles. Construction materials. Smoke from chimneys. A grid of small shapes where there had only been trees and silence before I steered the boat closer. Disbelief turning into a cold, heavy weight. 50 small cabins, fresh wood, metal roofs, and glass windows reflecting the morning sun, lined the shoreline and crawled up the inner hills like a settlement multiplying overnight. Gravel paths had been cut into the ground. Trees were missing, replaced by neat rows of structures. A dock had been built. A sign hung on one of the cabins. Stoneview Lakes HOA, Lakeside Retreat Village. My island had become a tourist resort. I stepped onto the shore, feeling the ground that should have been familiar now scarred by tire tracks and heavy machinery. There were people everywhere. Guests carrying bags, maintenance workers repairing wooden steps, HOA volunteers wearing matching t-shirts patrolling as if they owned the place. They moved with confidence born from believing they had rights. Rights they absolutely did not have. The cabins were not temporary. They were fully built, furnished, offered as rentals, and clearly advertised. The island had been turned into a money-making machine, a private wilderness getaway, sold under the brand of an HOA that had absolutely no ownership or authority here. At first, I wondered if they were mistaken. Maybe they thought this was public land. Maybe a paperwork error. Maybe some legal confusion had led them to believe they could build on it. But when I saw the official HOA community board posted near the dock, with rules, rental rates, fines, and member names printed proudly, I realized the truth. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a full-scale land grab. The HOA had taken my absence as an opportunity. They had built an entire community, 50 cabins, utility setups, sewage systems, solar towers, and security routes. All without a single permit, without a single permission, and without any fear of consequences. As I walked deeper into the cluster of cabins, my shock slowly hardened into something darker. The air smelled different. Fresh-cut lumber instead of pine trees, distant laughter instead of the quiet rustle of wind, engines buzzing where there should have been silence. The island I remembered had been replaced by a manipulated version of itself, manufactured for profit. And the most disturbing part? Everything looked polished, organized, and intentionally permanent. These cabins weren't makeshift or cheap. They were built with purpose, level foundations, uniform paint, matching decks, well-installed windows. It had taken planning, funding, and a coordinated effort. No small group could do this. This was a project backed by confidence and arrogance. The kind of arrogance that believed no one would challenge them. The kind of arrogance that assumed I would never return. I walked until I reached the center of the island, where my grandfather's old cabin once stood. It was gone, replaced by a community lodge. A sign explained the amenities inside: guest registration, maps, rental payments, and HOA administration. My jaw tightened. They hadn't just taken my land, they had erased my family's history. In the distance, I noticed a group of HOA officers gathered near the lodge. They were reviewing clipboards, approving maintenance tasks, and organizing events. Their posture was relaxed, as though the land beneath them had always belonged to them. They had no idea who I was. They had no idea whose island this truly was. They had no idea that the land deed was still in my possession, legally untouched and absolutely valid. They had no idea that everything they built, every cabin, every rental, every dollar earned, belonged not to them, but to me. And they certainly had no idea who had just returned. As I stood overlooking the cabins, the water sparkling behind me, the wind carrying the sounds of an HOA settlement that wasn't supposed to exist, a single realization took shape. They were about to pay, not because I needed revenge, but because I owned every square inch of this island, and they had built 50 homes on my property without permission. A year ago, I left this island in peace. Now I had returned to reclaim it, and the HOA had no clue what was coming next. The next morning, I returned to the island with a clearer head, though the anger from the previous day still simmered beneath the surface. Overnight, I had reviewed the original deed, digital copies, legal records, and every historical document tied to my ownership. Nothing had changed. My claim was absolute, undisputed, and fully recorded with the county. There was no loophole they could exploit, no missing signature.
No expired validity.
The island was legally mine, fully and unquestionably. Yet 50 cabins, and the empire surrounding them, now stood on it as if I had never existed. Before taking action, I needed to understand how this had happened. How an HOA, of all things, gained the boldness to seize land and create an entire resort without the faintest shadow of legality. Arrogance alone wasn't sufficient. Something had enabled them. Maybe they bribed officials. Maybe they forged papers. Maybe they simply assumed no one would challenge them. Whatever the truth was, I was determined to find it. I approached the dock early, standing among the morning buzz. Visitors in hiking boots and vacation shirts stepped off rented boats. The HOA volunteers welcomed them like trained hosts, guiding them toward check-in. The place had turned into a precise, polished operation. Every detail was engineered to appear legitimate. But legitimacy couldn't be built on stolen land. I moved among the cabins, observing quietly. The infrastructure was surprisingly extensive. Solar towers provided electricity. Underground water tanks had been installed. Trails had been shaped into neat walkways with gravel outlines. Security cameras monitored the property. The entire settlement was designed with permanence in mind. This was not an impulsive project. It had taken time, planning, and coordination. Evidence of heavy construction littered the island: piles of leftover lumber, concrete bags, bins of tools, machinery tracks hardened into the soil. They had bulldozed sections of the forest to carve space for the cabins, and the scars remained visible. The more I studied, the more I realized they had moved like people certain of ownership. Yet every step they took, from cutting a tree to building a cabin, had been trespassing in its purest form. Near the community lodge, a whiteboard displayed weekend activities and rental availability. The cabins were almost fully booked for the next 2 months. A premium lakeside cabin cost more per night than most hotel rooms in the city, and all that revenue, every dollar, had been funneled directly into the HOA's hands. They had not only taken my land, they had turned it into a profit machine. I entered the lodge with quiet determination. Inside, I found the HOA's administrative hub. A desk with labeled file trays, a printer, brochures showing smiling families in front of the cabins, and a detailed map of Stoneview Lake's retreat village. At a small counter, a volunteer sorted reservation forms. While she worked, I noticed a binder left open on a nearby table. Rental statements, monthly income reports, costs, membership fees, their entire financial structure laid bare. They were making tens of thousands per week. My jaw tightened. The scale of their theft had grown far beyond cabins and land. They had built an industry. I photographed everything, the maps, the records, the paperwork, the rental rates. Not to confront them yet, but to build a case far stronger than their expectations. After leaving the lodge, I walked toward the upper ridge of the island to see how deep the construction extended. Halfway up the slope, I discovered something new. An area fenced off with temporary barriers, piles of lumber waiting to be transformed into even more cabins. Signs marked the future plans. 20 more rental units, an event deck, and a luxury viewing platform overlooking the lake. They weren't done. They were still expanding. The HOA saw this island as their crown jewel, a long-term project, a centerpiece for their brand, and they believed no one stood in their way. Behind the construction site, a small camp had been set up for workers. I found tools, documents, blueprints rolled inside waterproof tubes. One drawing caught my attention, the master plan. It detailed the entire island divided into sectors, color-coded with construction phases. Phase 3, the next step, involved clearing another 10 acres of forest. Phase 4 proposed a second dock, a large communal hall, and even a boat rental center. The scale was breathtaking and sickening. I tucked the blueprint into my bag, knowing it would be critical evidence. With every passing moment, the HOA's violations multiplied. Trespassing, illegal construction, environmental damage, zoning fraud, theft, forgery, fraudulent business operations, possibly bribery. What they had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was criminal. By the time I reached the western shore, I felt the weight of the island's transformation more heavily than ever. The sunset reflected against the cabins, casting long shadows across the water. It was beautiful in a manufactured way, artificially peaceful, carefully curated, designed for profit. But below that beauty was theft. And beneath that theft was the assumption that no one would ever return to claim what was rightfully theirs. As evening arrived, I sat on the rocks near the water, thinking through the next steps. Confronting the HOA directly would achieve nothing. They would deny everything. They would claim confusion, misunderstanding, clerical errors. They would pretend they thought the island was abandoned. They would twist the narrative into something palatable. But evidence didn't lie. I needed their guard down. I needed them unaware that I knew everything. I needed them to continue operating like nothing was wrong until the truth could strike like a tidal wave. I crafted a plan. Not impulsive, not emotional, but strategic. First, gather every piece of evidence. Second, trace every financial trail they created. Third, identify every official who supported their illegal expansion. Fourth, present all findings directly to the county and the state. Fifth, reassert ownership with full legal force. But the final piece of the plan, the sixth step, was the one that would change everything. If they wanted to run a resort on my land, they would pay for every cabin, every rental, every footstep, every tree cut, every dollar earned. The entire island would become theirs only on my terms, and those terms would not be cheap. The HOA had built an empire on someone else's land. And soon, that empire would begin paying rent. By the third day, the island no longer felt like a shocking discovery. It felt like a battlefield where the enemy still didn't know a war had begun. I spent the morning studying the HOA's movements from a distance, moving along the edges of the cabins, watching how people navigated the pathways, how workers hauled supplies, how volunteers greeted vacationers as if they were the proud gatekeepers of land they didn't own. The HOA operated with the arrogance of those who believe consequences are myths. They moved with the confidence of ownership, not the caution of trespassers. That arrogance would become their downfall. I had already collected enough evidence to bury them in legal trouble. But evidence alone couldn't dismantle something this large. Not when their operation was polished, profitable, and, on the surface, impressively organized. They weren't a small HOA fumbling their way through an accidental mistake. They were a machine. And to take down a machine, I needed leverage. Real leverage. So I divided my plan into 3 phases. Phase 1. Let the HOA reveal everything. As long as they believed the island was theirs, they would continue expanding, documenting, planning, and filing. Every document created, every rental logged, every financial record produced in the coming days would only tighten the noose around their own neck. They needed to feel secure, comfortable, untouchable. Phase 2. Discreetly contact the people who mattered. The county assessor, zoning enforcement, the environmental board, the state land registry. Each agency would receive carefully curated information, enough to spark interest but not enough to trigger immediate action. Not yet. Not until the HOA's violations reached their peak. Phase 3. Confrontation only when the damage was irreversible. Not damage to me but damage to them. When they built illegally, expanded illegally, made money illegally, cut trees illegally, and registered rentals illegally. I would wait until their operation was too large to hide, too public to downplay, too profitable to explain away. Only then would the hammer drop. With the plan forming into something sharp and calculated, I started the first phase by exploring deeper into the island's northern section. It was quieter there. Fewer guests, fewer cabins, more construction sites. This was where the future phases of the resort would unfold, and the HOA had left everything out in the open at the far edge of the forest clearing. I found a temporary office structure built from repurposed metal storage units. It was locked, but the windows gave glimpses of what lay inside. Maps spread across tables, cost breakdowns on corkboards, names of contractors, lists of materials ordered, and projected revenue charts estimating profits for the next 5 years. They had mapped out their future so carefully, without realizing it was built on someone else's property. Just behind the temporary office, I found the remnants of a burned scrap pile. Ashes, charred pages, partial documents. The HOA had tried to destroy something, but burning paper didn't erase what remained around it. Melted pockets of plastic sleeves, twisted metal clips, partially burned legal forms with signatures that didn't match any official documentation I'd ever seen on file. Forged permits, fake zoning approvals, counterfeit construction authorization. The HOA's lies weren't accidental, they were systemic. I photographed everything carefully, every page corner, every signature fragment, every barcode on a melted document sleeve. This would become the backbone of what authorities needed to take serious action. As I continued deeper into the northern clearing, I stumbled upon a sight even more incriminating. An environmental violation so blatant it nearly stopped me in my tracks. A marsh area, one that had been protected for decades, had been drained and flattened to make way for future cabins. Pipes stuck out of the ground like skeletal remains. The soil cracked where water once rested, and deep machinery tracks scarred the land. The environmental board would have a field day with this. I added another set of photos to my growing gallery of evidence. Everything they destroyed, everything they built, everything they forged, it was all stacking up like dry wood waiting for a spark. By the afternoon, I made my way back toward the main lodge, blending into the flow of tourists. That's when I overheard 2 volunteers discussing the upcoming grand expansion announcement. The HOA president would be hosting a gathering the next morning, revealing the resort's new construction phases, inviting guests to invest, and showcasing long-term plans. Perfect. Their arrogance was about to hand me everything on a silver platter. If the HOA president announced expansion plans publicly, on video, in front of witnesses, that footage would become proof that they knowingly developed land they didn't own. It would be the final piece of the puzzle, the last nail in the coffin. I positioned myself in a quiet corner and observed them setting up a small stage beside the lodge. Banners reading Stoneview Lakes HOA, Building the Future were being attached to wooden stakes. Brochures were being printed. Refreshments were stacked on tables. The atmosphere carried excitement, anticipation for a future built on a stolen foundation. This was the moment I had been waiting for. They would reveal everything, and I would record everything. As the sun dipped into the horizon, casting warm light across the water, I took a seat on the highest point of the island, the ridge overlooking both shores. From there, I could see the full scope of what the HOA had done. 50 cabins, trails, solar fields, docks, ladders, boats, equipment, signs, visitors strolling across land that had once been undisturbed. The view should have been insulting, but instead it was strategic, because the HOA had laid out their crimes in clean, organized rows, like evidence arranged in a courtroom. They couldn't deny what they had built. They couldn't hide the cabins. They couldn't cover the trails carved through the forest. They couldn't silence the drone of generators or the hum of solar panels. Every nail they hammered into the wood was a nail into their own legal coffin. By nightfall, I had organized the evidence on my laptop: photos, maps, documents, recordings, blueprints, forged signatures, environmental damage, financial records, and saved everything to multiple encrypted backups. The trap was set. And tomorrow, when the HOA stepped proudly onto their stage to celebrate what they believed was a flawless victory, I would be there, quiet, invisible, watching, recording, waiting for the moment when their own words became the blade that cut through their lies. The next morning arrived with a stillness that hovered over the island like the calm before a storm. The water was smooth, reflecting streaks of gold from the rising sun. The cabins buzzed quietly with early risers, vacationers preparing for hikes, couples heading for the lake, families gathering near the lodge for breakfast. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. But beneath that peace was a truth the HOA still didn't know. They were standing on a time bomb made of their own decisions. Today would be the day they unknowingly lit the fuse. As I walked through the center of the settlement, I noticed volunteers proudly gathering around the newly constructed stage. It was decorated with banners and presentation boards showing maps of future cabin expansions and projected revenue charts. They had even installed a small podium with a microphone connected to portable speakers. The HOA wanted this event to feel official, polished, and visionary. They wanted people to believe they were pioneers, building a future community on a remote island that they believed wrongly was theirs. Guests were already assembling, sipping coffee and chatting eagerly. Some looked excited, others curious, and a few seemed ready to invest in timeshares the HOA planned to unveil. Everything about the scene showcased confidence, the kind that came from believing their empire was unbreakable. The HOA president arrived shortly after. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed himself untouchable. A group of board members followed behind him carrying binders, tablets, and rolled-up plans. They looked like executives preparing for a corporate pitch, not criminals unveiling the extent of their illegal operations. I positioned myself at the edge of the crowd, pretending to admire a cabin, all while keeping a clear view of the stage. In my pocket, a discreet recording device was already running. My phone, too, captured the scene from a concealed angle. Everything they said today would be stored, transcribed, backed up, and eventually delivered directly to the agencies preparing to act. When the HOA president stepped onto the stage, he raised his hands to quiet the crowd. The volunteers beamed with pride. Guests leaned in with anticipation. And then the speech began. He spoke boldly about their success. He praised the board's hard work. He bragged about how far they had come in just a year. He referenced strategic land acquisition, the development opportunity they seized, and their exclusive control over this private island community. He described the cabins as permanent structures. He described the forest clearing as progress. He described the island as the HOA's new frontier. Every word he spoke tightened the trap. As he moved on to the future plans, Phase 3 cabins, luxury suites by the cliffs, a viewing deck overlooking the lake, a new dock expansion, and event facilities for weddings and corporate gatherings, the crowd applauded. They were impressed by the ambition, unaware that ambition built on stolen land was nothing more than delusion wrapped in confidence. The president held up a map, showing the island divided by color-coded zones. Each zone represented an illegal construction plan. Each line represented boundaries they had no right to alter. Each icon represented cabins that belonged not to them, but to me. He continued on with revenue forecasts, long-term rental projections, and investment opportunities. Some people took notes, others whispered about buying shares or reserving cabins for peak seasons. I kept recording. The board members chimed in occasionally, bragging about partnerships with contractors and suppliers, contractors who would soon be interrogated by authorities about permits they never received, suppliers who would have to explain why they delivered materials to a location without zoning approval. Then, just at the peak of their presentation, the HOA president delivered the words that sealed their fate. He revealed they had no legal need to consult external owners, because the island was designated as unclaimed land. Unclaimed land. A statement so false, so reckless, so easy to disprove, it almost sounded like satire. In that moment, the final piece of evidence fell into place. He wasn't just mistaken, he was lying with absolute certainty. And lying publicly made it undeniable. The crowd applauded again. But to me, that applause sounded like the sharp click of a lock sealing shut. When the presentation ended, guests crowded the stage, asking about investment packages and membership opportunities. Volunteers handed out brochures showing expanded cabin models and long-term rental profit predictions. I slipped away, no longer needing to watch. Their words today would echo back at them in the form of legal consequences they could never outrun. That I moved toward the edge of the forest, feeling a shift in the air. Not in the island, but in my momentum. Until now, I had been observing, collecting, planning. Now, the transition had begun. The trap wasn't just set. It had already started tightening. Back at the shoreline, I boarded a small rental boat and drove it to the mainland. What awaited me there was the next crucial step. I had arranged a meeting, not with a lawyer, not with a journalist, not with a friend, but with every official who could dismantle the HOA's illegal empire from every angle: land registry, environmental enforcement, zoning compliance, county legal counsel, and the State Department responsible for land fraud. I arrived early and waited in a quiet, wood-paneled conference room. When the first official walked in, carrying a thick folder of my documents, I knew the wheels were starting to turn. Others followed, some with tablets, others with notebooks. Before long, the room was full. And that's when the real dismantling began. One by one, I laid out the evidence: photos, videos, recordings, blueprints, financial documents, forged signatures, environmental violations, destroyed wetlands, public announcements, projected expansions, everything. With each new piece, I watched the expressions of the officials shift from confusion to disbelief, and finally to sharp, decisive concern. They asked questions. I provided answers. They compared the evidence with their own records. And slowly a picture formed, one that left no room for interpretation. The HOA wasn't just guilty. They were catastrophically guilty. Multiple officials immediately began drafting requests for emergency inspections. The Environmental Board scheduled an urgent site visit. The county legal team prepared temporary shutdown orders. The land registry began verifying deed authenticity, mine, which was flawless, theirs, which didn't exist. By the time the meeting ended, the weight of the law had already started moving, and the HOA had no idea it was coming. I stepped out into the afternoon sun knowing that the next time I set foot on the island, everything would be different. The empire they built on lies was about to crumble, and I would be there to watch the first crack form. The final days before the investigation wrapped up were the strangest the island had ever seen. The same cabins that once echoed with music, tourists, and the constant hum of activity now sat in complete stillness. Every window was dark, every deck empty, every trail abandoned. The HOA members who once strutted across the property with clipboards and self-assigned authority now avoided the island entirely. The volunteers who had once believed they were part of something noble never returned. The silence revealed everything the noise had been hiding. Officials spent hours each day cataloging the details no one had paid attention to before. They documented erosion along the shoreline where machinery had torn up native vegetation. They mapped out the septic systems that were illegally installed too close to the waterline. They photographed piles of buried construction waste hidden beneath palm fronds. They labeled each violation with orange flags that fluttered like warnings in the sea breeze. Every time I walked the island, the damage became more obvious. Paths carved where no paths belonged. Trees uprooted to make space for rental cabins. Soil packed down where rare plants once grew. The HOA had claimed they were improving the island, but all they had done was scar it in ways they now had no power to deny. The investigators worked quietly but efficiently. Environmental specialists took soil samples and water readings. County accountants built spreadsheets that filled entire tables. Legal teams went cabin to cabin photographing evidence and gathering anything that showed profit, bookings, and transactions. It was all methodical, emotionless, deliberate. But behind those clinical steps was a growing realization. The HOA hadn't stumbled into a mistake. They had built a business on land they did not own and made sure they profited at every possible opportunity. What they called community development was nothing but opportunism disguised behind paperwork and arrogance. When the county attorney asked me for full access to my original land documentation, I handed them over without hesitation. They studied the signatures, dates, and stamps. The island was unquestionably mine, legally and permanently. That fact alone made everything the HOA did not just wrong, but reckless. As the days passed, the investigators' attitudes shifted. At first, they acted cautiously as though they expected confusion or conflicting claims. But by the end of the week, the tone hardened. They weren't piecing together a misunderstanding anymore. They were building a case. And every hour that passed pushed the HOA deeper into a situation none of them could escape. When the financial team delivered their preliminary calculations, even they looked stunned. The cabins had generated far more money than anyone anticipated. The HOA had marketed the island as a high-end getaway. Peak season rates, full occupancy, booking fees, add-on services, everything layered into profits that climbed shockingly fast. They had operated as if the island were their own resort. Now the truth was documented, recorded, and about to be presented. As I walked through the rows of silent cabins, the weight of everything settled in. For the first time since returning to the island, I felt the shift. The power no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the evidence, the truth, and the law. A reckoning was inevitable, and it was coming faster than any of them expected. With the investigation complete, the island entered a strange in-between state. The structures were still standing, but the people who filled them were gone. The land felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Officials packed their equipment while auditors finalized their reports. What had begun as a simple trespassing case had grown into something far larger, more complicated, and more damning. The financial team delivered their final findings first. Every transaction the HOA processed, every donation they collected, every booking they confirmed, all of it had flowed through their accounts without a trace of ownership rights. What seemed like an ambitious project on the surface had been nothing more than unauthorized profit. The total revenue they collected was staggering, especially when laid out line by line. Environmental specialists followed with their own report. The damage to the island wasn't superficial. Protected zones had been disturbed, wetlands had been altered, and native vegetation was removed without permits. The restoration cost alone was high enough to cripple most organizations, but it was unavoidable. The island couldn't heal on its own. Someone had to repair what the HOA had ruined. The HOA board gathered in the Lodge-turned temporary office to hear the results. Their confidence had evaporated. They sat stiffly, eyes cast downward, the weight of what they had done settling onto their shoulders. Papers rustled softly as the investigators distributed the documentation, photographs, violation codes, financial summaries, legal references, and environmental assessments. The truth was now printed in black and white. Some board members scanned the pages with shaking hands. Others stared blankly at the tables and charts. A few avoided looking at anything at all. They had built cabins, pathways, docks, and gathering spaces on land that did not belong to them. They had invited hundreds of guests. They had posted public advertisements. They had collected money openly. But the land was mine, and the law had confirmed it beyond any doubt. At the end of the meeting, the county attorney presented the final component: liability. The board members had hoped the government would absorb the cost or offer leniency. Instead, they found out that nearly every financial obligation, every violation, every environmental requirement was their responsibility. The sums were so large that conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the most confident board members sat frozen, unable to process the magnitude. Then came the moment they were least prepared for. The attorney turned toward me and asked how I intended to handle the cabins themselves. They could be removed, abandoned, or claimed. The choice was mine. The room grew silent as the board waited. My decision was simple. They had operated rentals on my land. Now they would pay rent to me. I watched their faces shift from confusion to disbelief to devastation. The cabins they had proudly bragged about were now a financial chain around their own organization's neck. They couldn't walk away, they needed to pay. They couldn't argue, the evidence was overwhelming. And they couldn't negotiate, the terms were already documented. Month after month, year after year, they would be legally obligated to compensate me for every square foot they had taken without permission. The cabins that symbolized their ambition would now fund the repair of the island and secure its future for generations. The board dispersed slowly after the meeting, drifting into groups that whispered angrily among themselves. Accusations started almost immediately. Each tried to shift blame. Some insisted they never fully understood the project. Others claimed they were misled. But none of it mattered anymore. The consequences were unavoidable. The officials completed their final checks, packed up their materials, and prepared to leave. As they boarded their boats, the island returned to silence once again. I remained standing near the shore, watching the boats disappear into the horizon. The sun cast long shadows across the cabins. Structures that were built illegally, claimed boldly, and lost completely. The island felt different now. Not wounded, but reclaiming itself. The air was cleaner, the wind softer, the ocean calmer. The damage would take time to repair, but justice had been delivered. And in the end, the HOA that tried to take everything from me was paying rent for the very cabins they built. A perfect ending to a theft that never succeeded.